Let me be completely honest with you right now, because this is something that a lot of tech channels are dancing around, and I think you deserve a straight, no-nonsense conversation about what is actually happening in the GPU industry in 2026. For the better part of the last 10 years, if you wanted the best graphics card on the planet, you bought Nvidia. If you wanted the best chip for artificial intelligence workloads, you bought Nvidia. If you wanted the fastest, most feature-rich, most reliable GPU experience available to both consumers and enterprises alike, there was really only one answer, and that answer was always Nvidia. The Green Team built such an overwhelming lead in hardware performance, software ecosystems, developer tools, and brand perception that competing against them seemed almost pointless to most observers. AMD tried hard, Intel eventually tried, and for a very long time, trying was essentially all they could do, but something has fundamentally changed in 2026. And I genuinely believe we are watching one of the most significant shifts in PC hardware history unfold in real time right before our eyes. AMD and Intel are not just nibbling at the edges of Nvidia's empire anymore. They are coming for the crown itself, and this time around they have the hardware, the software, the pricing strategy, and the momentum to make that threat genuinely real and sustained. Before we go any further, let me be clear about one important thing. This video is not a Nvidia hit piece, and I am not here to tell you that the Green Team is finished. Nvidia still makes incredible products across the board. The RTX 5090 is still the fastest consumer GPU money can buy by a meaningful margin. The Blackwell architecture powering their enterprise AI accelerators is genuinely impressive engineering. CUDA remains the dominant platform for AI development worldwide, and that will not change dramatically overnight. None of that is going away, but what is changing is the competitive narrative, the alternatives available to consumers and businesses. And most importantly, the value equation that people face when they actually go to spend their money on GPU hardware. That change is bigger and more meaningful than most mainstream tech coverage is giving it credit for right now. So let us get into it properly and thoroughly, because this story has many layers that are all worth understanding clearly. To really appreciate what is happening in 2026, you need to understand how Nvidia got to where they are in the first place, because their dominance was not just about making great GPUs. The real and deeper foundation of Nvidia's market position is a technology called CUDA, which stands for Compute Unified Device Architecture. Nvidia introduced CUDA back in 2006, and at the time it was a genuinely revolutionary concept. It allowed software developers to harness the massive parallel processing power sitting inside Nvidia GPUs for general-purpose computing tasks that had nothing to do with rendering graphics. Scientists could run complex simulations dramatically faster. Researchers could process enormous datasets in hours instead of weeks. Engineers could run sophisticated modeling software with performance that was simply not achievable before on conventional processors. And then artificial intelligence arrived and changed everything. When the deep learning revolution hit and researchers discovered that training neural networks on GPUs was orders of magnitude faster than on CPUs, CUDA was already there waiting for them with open arms. The entire AI research community built its tools, its frameworks, its institutional workflows, and its collective knowledge on top of CUDA and Nvidia hardware over the years that followed. PyTorch, TensorFlow, Cuddman, Encol, all of the foundational AI development tools that power the modern machine learning ecosystem were built with CUDA woven deeply into their core. Companies spent years and in many cases hundreds of millions of dollars building CUDA-based development pipelines and production systems. Universities structured their AI curricula around the assumption that students would have Nvidia GPUs. The ecosystem became self-reinforcing in a way that made switching away from Nvidia not just technically inconvenient but genuinely costly in ways that went far beyond the price tag of the hardware itself. That software ecosystem lock-in is the moat that Nvidia built, and for a very long time it was essentially impenetrable by any competitor. But moats are not permanent. They erode over time when alternatives improve, and they can be crossed if someone is patient enough and determined enough to build the infrastructure needed. That is precisely what AMD and Intel have been doing for years now, quietly and persistently, while much of the tech media was busy declaring the GPU wars over with Nvidia as the permanent victor. AMD's story in 2026 begins with their ARNA 4 GPU architecture, and I want to spend real time on this because the improvements AMD has delivered with this generation are significant enough that they deserve far more credit than they typically receive. Think back to where AMD stood just a few years ago with the ARNA 3 generation. The ARC 7000 series delivered mixed results. Some cards, like the ARC 7900 XTX, offered genuinely excellent rasterization performance and outstanding value, but AMD remained clearly behind Nvidia in ray tracing performance, behind in upscaling quality with FUR 3 compared to DLS 3, and still dealing with the persistent perception problem that choosing AMD meant accepting meaningful compromises. The enthusiast community had largely settled into a pattern where Nvidia was the right choice for people who wanted the complete package and AMD was the choice for budget-conscious buyers willing to trade features for value. That pattern had held for years, and most people assumed it would continue indefinitely. ARNA 4 breaks that pattern decisively. The RX 9070 and RX 9070 XT are not just incrementally better than their predecessors, they represent a genuine qualitative shift in what it means to own an AMD GPU, starting with ray tracing, which has been AMD's biggest weakness for multiple GPU generations. AMD completely redesigned their ray accelerator hardware for ARNA 4 from the ground up, dramatically increasing throughput per compute unit and improving the architecture's ability to handle complex ray tracing scenarios that previous AMD hardware struggled with badly. The result is ray tracing performance in real gaming workloads that is genuinely competitive with Nvidia's equivalent tier products. In titles that use ray tracing extensively at 144p and 4000 resolution, the performance gap between an RX 9070 XT and an RTX 5070 is small enough that most real-world gamers playing on actual monitors would struggle to identify which card rendered which frame. That is a statement that could not have been made honestly about any previous AMD GPU compared to its Nvidia counterpart, and it matters enormously for AMD's credibility in the enthusiast market. AMD's FUR for upscaling technology is the second major leap forward with ARNA 4. FUR has always been the underdog in the upscaling wars, and for good reason tied to real technical limitations. FUR 1 was a purely spatial upscaler applying mathematical sharpening to lower resolution frames, producing visible artifacts and soft image quality that fell clearly short of Nvidia's DLS. FUR 2 improved things by becoming a temporal upscaler that analyzed multiple frames, but it still lagged behind DLS 2 and produced more ghosting and fast-moving scenes. FUR 4 is finally the version where AMD matched the approach Nvidia has used successfully for several generations. By building dedicated machine learning acceleration hardware directly into ARNA for compute units and training a proper neural network-based upscaling model on high-quality image data, the results are dramatically improved. At 144p upscaling to 4000, FUR produces image quality that most people in blind testing cannot reliably distinguish from DLS4. The ghosting and shimmer artifacts that plagued earlier FUR versions are largely eliminated. Fine detail like hair, distant foliage, and intricate surfaces is reconstructed with much greater accuracy. This is the FUR AMD has needed to make their GPU lineup a truly no-compromise choice for gamers. Then there is the pricing reality, and this is where AMD is landing the most commercially impactful punches against Nvidia. The RX 9070 XT at its launch price delivers gaming performance that competes directly with the RTX 5070 Ti while costing substantially less when you calculate the actual cost per frame at 144p. Across a broad range of shipping titles, AMD wins clearly and consistently. The RX 9070 at its retail price point may well be the single best value gaming GPU available in 2026 by a significant margin. Nvidia's response has been telling. They have been more aggressive on pricing for the RTX 5060 family than they were for the higher-tier 5070 and 5080 products, which communicates exactly how much AMD's mid-range pressure is affecting their pricing decisions, when a company that has been confidently charging premium prices for years suddenly feels the need to compete more aggressively in the segments where the highest volume of units are sold, that is, competition working exactly as it should. Moving beyond consumer gaming, AMD's enterprise compute story in 2026 is equally impressive and arguably more strategically consequential. The Instinct Me300X accelerator has been AMD's flagship play for the AI data center market, and it has been winning enterprise deals that would have seemed implausible 3 years ago. The Me300X brings 192 gigabytes of HBM3 high-bandwidth memory in a unified memory architecture, which directly addresses one of the most painful bottlenecks in large language model deployment when running inference on frontier-scale models with hundreds of billions of parameters, fitting those weights entirely within GPU memory without complex partitioning determines efficiency and speed. Nvidia's H100 with 80 GB of HBM2E frequently requires complex multi-GPU setups to host the largest production models, adding latency and operational complexity. The Me300X can host significantly larger models on a single chip. And for high-throughput inference, this architectural advantage translates into meaningful cost and performance benefits that enterprise procurement teams care about deeply. AMD's ROCm software platform has also reached genuine maturity in 2026. The ROCm 6 series brought substantially improved compatibility with popular AI frameworks, significantly better debugging and profiling tools, much more comprehensive documentation, and targeted performance optimizations that close real gaps with CUDA. For many commonly run workloads, major cloud providers have expanded their AMD GPU instance offerings, and growing availability of ROCm-compatible managed AI services means engineering teams can now realistically adopt AMD hardware for inference without needing to develop deep ROCm expertise internally. That reduction in practical friction is critically important because the organizational switching cost has always been just as significant a barrier as the technical capability gap. Intel's GPU story deserves honest evaluation rather than the dismissive treatment it often gets. When Intel Arc launched with the Alchemist generation, the reception was brutal and largely justified. Driver problems were real and frustrating. Performance was inconsistent in ways that seemed random. Intel's marketing was confused and unconvincing. The tech community largely wrote Intel off as a GPU maker after Alchemist. Intel did not give up. They shipped driver update after driver update, fixing performance issues and improving stability. The A770 evolved from a card with serious caveats into a genuine budget option, and then Battlemage arrived and the entire conversation around Intel GPUs changed completely. The Arc B580 launched in late 2024 and genuinely surprised the industry. 12 GB of GDDR6 memory on a mid-range card when Nvidia was shipping 8 GB on comparable products. Performance matching or beating the RTX 4060 at a lower price. Driver quality dramatically improved over Alchemist. This was Intel's first real moment of genuine GPU market credibility. The broader Battlemage lineup continued building momentum through 2025 and into 2026. XeSS, Intel's AI upscaling technology, now supports a much wider library of games and delivers image quality that competes reasonably with AMD's FUR, Intel Arc. In 2026 is a legitimate and competitive option for budget and mid-range gamers that deserves inclusion in honest buying recommendations. Where Intel is making moves that Nvidia's enterprise division needs to monitor most closely is in the data center AI accelerator market with Gaudi 3. Intel's strategy with Gaudi is straightforward and powerful: deliver meaningfully lower pricing than Nvidia while providing competitive performance on the inference workloads that enterprise AI customers run most frequently at scale. Gaudi 3 is not positioned to beat Nvidia's H200 in peak training throughput across all scenarios, and Intel is not pretending otherwise. Instead, Gaudi 3 is specifically optimized for inference, where the economics of GPU compute matter most to enterprise buyers making ongoing operational expenditure decisions. Multiple major cloud providers now offer Gaudi 3 instances as a lower-cost alternative to Nvidia GPU instances for large language model inference. The cost per inference token advantage that Gaudi 3 can offer for certain model architectures and deployment configurations is real and quantifiable. And enterprise finance teams evaluating massive AI compute budgets are taking it seriously. The VRAM conversation is another dimension of the 2026 GPU market that deserves specific attention because memory capacity has become an increasingly important differentiating factor. Games at high-quality settings are using more VRAM than ever before, particularly titles using high-resolution texture packs and sophisticated rendering pipelines. AI-assisted features within games require additional memory overhead, and the rise of running large language models and image generation tools locally on consumer GPUs has created a new category of memory-hungry workloads that enthusiasts care about. AMD's ARC's 9070 and 9070 XT both ship with 16 GB of GDDR6. Intel's Battlemage cards have also shipped with notably more VRAM than Nvidia equivalents at similar price points. Nvidia has faced genuine criticism for shipping 8 GB on the RTX 5060 Ti, which many reviewers argue is insufficient for a card at that price in 2026, whether driven by cost, supply chain, or deliberate strategy. The result is that AMD and Intel have a real and resonant talking point around memory capacity that is reaching mainstream buyer awareness. The gaming community's cultural attitude toward GPU purchasing has also shifted in ways that matter commercially. 5 years ago, many gaming communities had a strong cultural bias toward Nvidia that sometimes bordered on tribalism, dismissing AMD cards reflexively regardless of their actual performance and value. That dynamic has changed noticeably in 2026. The combination of AMD delivering genuinely competitive performance, Nvidia shipping products that enthusiasts feel are overpriced relative to their generational improvement, and the broader availability of trustworthy independent benchmark reviews has made the gaming community significantly more open to evaluating all options on actual merits. Enthusiasts who have owned and lived with an ARC's 9070 XT for several months are reporting great driver stability, impressive FUR for quality, competitive ray tracing, and meaningful savings compared to Nvidia, and those testimonials spread through communities and change the ambient reputation that shapes purchasing decisions for mainstream buyers who rely on community consensus as a trust signal. So what does all of this add up to, and what should you actually take away from this conversation? The GPU market in 2026 is the most genuinely competitive it has been in over a decade, and that competition is benefiting consumers and businesses at every level. AMD has delivered an architecture in ARNA for that is competitive across gaming, creative workloads, and enterprise AI compute. Intel has proven with Battlemage and Gaudi 3 that their GPU ambitions are real and improving generation over generation. The CUDA software lock-in, while still real and substantial, is weakening at the edges as ROC matures and AI framework portability improves. Enterprise customers who have been paying Nvidia's premium prices without real alternatives are discovering that alternatives now exist and are worth genuine evaluation. For individual consumers, the practical implication is clear. Do not default to Nvidia without seriously evaluating what AMD offers at the same price point, because in 2026 AMD's value proposition has never been stronger and the compromises that used to define the AMD experience have largely been eliminated for developers. CUDA remains the safest and most ecosystem-rich choice for new projects, but ROCm is mature enough to evaluate seriously for inference-focused workloads. For enterprise AI teams managing large infrastructure budgets, both AMD Instinct and Intel Gaudi deserve genuine technical and commercial evaluation because the potential cost savings compared to Nvidia are meaningful and real at scale. Nvidia will remain powerful, profitable, and technologically impressive for the foreseeable future. They have too much technology, too deep a software ecosystem, and too large an installed base to be displaced quickly by anyone. But the era of unchallenged dominance that allowed them to operate without meaningful competitive pressure is ending. The crown that Nvidia has worn so comfortably for the past decade is now being seriously and credibly contested by two companies that have learned from past failures, invested heavily in the right areas, and arrived at a moment where their technology is finally ready to compete at the highest level. The GPU wars of 2026 are the most interesting they have been in years. Stay plugged in, keep watching the benchmarks, evaluate all your options honestly, and let the hardware speak for itself rather than letting brand loyalty make your decisions. See you in the next one. The data center and cloud computing angle of this GPU story connects to consumer hardware in ways that are not immediately obvious but matter for understanding the full competitive picture. Nvidia's dominance in AI accelerators has been enormously profitable and has funded their continued investment in consumer GPU technology, driver development, and software ecosystem maintenance. The premium pricing that enterprises have paid for H100 and H200 hardware has effectively subsidized Nvidia's position across the entire product stack from top to bottom. If AMD and Intel succeed in capturing meaningful enterprise AI market share with Instinct and Gaudi hardware respectively, it does not just hurt Nvidia's enterprise revenue directly, it potentially reduces the resources Nvidia has available to maintain their advantages in consumer markets and developer ecosystems over the long term. Competition at the enterprise level has long-term implications that reach all the way down to the gaming GPU market that most everyday consumers care about most directly and personally. Looking at the specific software ecosystem developments enabling this competitive shift, the progress that open-source AI frameworks have made in supporting non-NVIDIA hardware is particularly significant for understanding where things are heading. PyTorch, which is the dominant framework for AI research and an increasingly important framework for production deployment, has invested heavily in back-end portability through improved ROCm support. Researchers who previously had no real practical choice but to use NVIDIA hardware because their codebase depended on CUDA-specific optimizations now have a clearer path to running the same code on AMD hardware with reasonable performance. This does not eliminate the CUDA advantage immediately or completely. The ecosystem of CUDA-specific libraries, the deep muscle memory of experienced machine learning engineers, and the extensive performance optimization work done specifically for CUDA over many years all represent real and ongoing advantages that do not disappear overnight, but the trajectory is clearly toward greater hardware portability in AI development, and that trend benefits every non-NVIDIA hardware vendor that can execute on their software stack. The geopolitical and supply chain dimensions of the GPU market are also worth acknowledging, because they have shaped enterprise buying behavior in ways that have created opportunities for AMD and Intel that pure technical competition alone might not have generated as quickly. Export restrictions on advanced AI chips to certain countries and regions have created supply constraints and planning uncertainty around NVIDIA's global availability that enterprise customers find genuinely uncomfortable when making large multi-year infrastructure investment decisions. Diversifying GPU supply chains away from single vendor dependency has become a strategic priority for many large technology companies and cloud providers, and both AMD and Intel have benefited from organizations that want viable alternatives for geopolitical risk management reasons in addition to cost and performance reasons. This is a tailwind for NVIDIA's competitors that is structural rather than temporary and will continue shaping enterprise purchasing decisions for years to come regardless of how the pure technical competition plays out. What all of this adds up to when you step back and look at the complete picture is a GPU industry in 2026 that is being genuinely reshaped by competition for the first time in many years. The hardware choices available to consumers have never been more genuinely competitive across the price spectrum. The enterprise AI compute market, which seemed like Nvidia's permanent kingdom just 3 years ago, now has credible challengers offering real value at meaningful scale. The software ecosystems that created lock-in are opening up, and the cultural conversation in tech communities about GPU purchasing has shifted from Nvidia being the default obvious choice to a genuine three-way evaluation where AMD and Intel both earn real consideration based on the actual merits of their products that is healthy for the industry, healthy for innovation, and most directly healthy for your wallet as someone who buys and uses this hardware.